to ScienceTelly.
13 millimeters of flint. That is the exact size of the arrowhead a radiologist finally spotted lodged beneath a 5,300-year-old shoulder blade, a full decade after the world assumed the man had simply frozen to death in the Alps. It had been sitting there the whole time, a silent witness waiting for someone to look with the right machine. That single overlooked detail completely rewrote one of the oldest deaths on human record, and it is not alone. Across the last few decades, radiologists armed with CT scanners have walked into 10 separate cold cases, some spanning millennia, and quietly dismantled everything historians thought they knew. Some verdicts grew exponentially darker. At least one became far less sinister than anyone imagined. By the time we reach the end of this journey, you will know which ancient death still has an open case file, and which one scientists cleared of murder entirely.
Our descent into the past starts deep underground in a limestone cave carved into the brutal landscape of Cheddar Gorge in southwest England. In the early 1990s, archaeologists pulled human bones from the earth that were roughly 14,700 years old, and instantly they knew something was wrong. Some bones had been snapped open, while the skulls had been meticulously shaped into bowls. For years, historians debated whether this was simply the result of animal scavenging or a complex post-mortem ritual where bodies were moved long after death. Neither theory survived contact with the microscope. In 2011, three-dimensional imaging unleashed a chilling reality: cut marks, chew marks, and percussion damage that mirrored experimental butchery with terrifying exactness. The skulls had been carefully stripped of flesh to craft cups, standing as the oldest confirmed physical evidence of cannibalism in Europe. What remains a mystery is why it happened. Was it pure, desperate survival in a freezing Ice Age wasteland? Or does the careful ceremonial preparation point to a dark mortuary tradition? Nearly 15,000 years later, the jury is still out. Fast forward to 1897, in a desolate peat bog in the northeastern Netherlands. Laborers cutting turf unearthed a nightmare: a body, dark and leathery, with a braided woolen band wound tight around its neck 3 times. Later analysis identified her as a 16-year-old girl who died sometime between 54 BCE and 128 CE.
Modern scanning affirmed she had been brutally strangled with that very band and unearthed a previously hidden stab wound near her collarbone. For decades, researchers fixated on one grim detail: half of her head was shaved, which they assumed was a mark of ritual humiliation or the brand of a sacrificial victim. But that macabre detail is now genuinely contested. Modern comparisons suggest her lopsided hair might just be a trick of the bog, caused by one side being exposed to the air slightly longer than the other. What is not contested is that she was young, afflicted with scoliosis, and possessed a limp that would have made her a target.
We know someone decided she had to die, but whether it was a divine sacrifice, a vicious punishment, or a targeted murder, her killers left no confession behind. Over in central Jutland, Denmark, around 400 BCE, another body was found in a bog. He lies curled in a peaceful, almost sleeping position, save for the braided leather noose still tight around his neck. Tollund Man's cause of death was obvious the second he was pulled from the earth, but the real secret was hiding in his stomach. A meticulous forensic reanalysis of his gut contents revealed a porridge of barley, flax, and a weed called pale persicaria, consumed just 12 to 24 hours before he was hanged. Popular history loves to paint this as a mystical, sacrificial feast, but the reality discovered by researchers was surprisingly ordinary Iron Age fare. The only chilling detail that raises eyebrows is the presence of threshing waste, crop debris normally discarded, that seems to have been deliberately left in his food. It could point to a dark ritual prepared for the condemned, or it could just be a quiet, gritty last meal before a standard execution. The debate is still simmering. Across the sea, in Cheshire, England, forensic experts examining a body pulled from Lindow moss uncovered a nightmare they nicknamed the Triple Death. This first-century man had his skull fractured by a massive blunt force strike. His neck bore the deep grooves of a vicious garroting, and his throat had been slit. Any one of those wounds was fatal. His stomach held a burnt griddle cake and traces of mistletoe pollen, a detail that sent imaginations running wild with visions of ancient druidic sacrifices. But was it?
Other experts argue the tiny quantity of pollen was a mere trace, an accident, or even a folk remedy for stomach cramps. Lindow Man might not be a mystical sacrifice at all. He might simply be the victim of a breathtakingly brutal, ordinary murder, dressed up by modern myth-making. Sometimes it isn't a single body that holds a secret, but an entire city. In 79 CE, Mount Vesuvius buried Pompeii, and for centuries, the twisting, clenched plaster casts of its victims were read as the agonizing, gasping throes of slow suffocation under volcanic ash. CT scanners complicated that tragedy. Researchers estimate the pyroclastic surge hit Pompeii at up to 300 degrees Celsius, hot enough to kill in a blinding flash of thermal shock. Under this reading, the famous boxer's pose wasn't a desperate fight for breath. It was muscle tissue instantly contracting in the fraction of a second before death, flash frozen in ash.
Yet, the case remains furiously contested. Down the road in Herculaneum, scientists argue for a slower death by dehydration at slightly lower temperatures. Even among experts studying the exact same apocalypse, the timeline of death is still a battlefield. Climb now to over 22,000 feet into the freezing Andes, to a mountain called Llullaillaco. In 1999, archaeologists uncovered the frozen body of a teenage girl sacrificed in an Inca capacocha ritual roughly 500 years ago. The chilling part wasn't how she died, it was how she lived her final months. Because hair locks in a chemical timeline of the bloodstream, forensics could track the last 2 years of her life with terrifying precision. About a year before her death, her diet abruptly shifted from peasant scraps to elite luxuries like meat, maize, and coca leaves. In her final months, her intake of coca and intoxicating chicha alcohol spiked drastically, proving her captors were heavily sedating her as she was marched up the peak.
A separate protein analysis added a darker layer. She was suffering from a chronic lung infection, likely tuberculosis. She didn't just freeze to death. She was sick, heavily drugged, and left utterly alone at the edge of the sky. But what happens when the forensic evidence actually clears the suspect? In 1987, archaeologists in northern Peru unearthed the Lord of Sipán, an impossibly wealthy Moche ruler buried around the year 300. Surrounding his tomb were 8 other bodies, retainers brutally killed to accompany him into the afterlife. With that kind of carnage at the perimeter, you expect a violent end for the man at the center. But when scientists put his bones under the scope, the violent narrative collapsed. There were no healed fractures, no cut marks, no trauma of any kind. Instead, they found early arthritis and signs of a long-term wasting illness. The Lord of Sipán likely died peacefully from disease. It is a stark reminder, surrounding a body with murder doesn't mean the man in the center was murdered too.
This exact scenario played out with one of history's most famous mysteries. For decades, a suspicious hole in the back of King Tutankhamun's skull fueled a seductive theory that the 19-year-old pharaoh was assassinated. In 2010, full-body CT scans and DNA testing obliterated that conspiracy. The hole in his skull wasn't a death blow. it was post-mortem damage from embalmers. The true killer was a body that had been quietly failing him his entire life. He suffered from a clubfoot, a bone-destroying condition called Kohler disease, and a severe unhealed leg fracture that had likely gone necrotic. Layered over this genetic ruin, scientists extracted the DNA of the deadliest strain of malaria from his 3,000-year-old tissue. The boy king wasn't murdered in the shadows. He was a frail teenager whose weakened immune system finally surrendered to one infection too many.
While Tutankhamun's murder was a myth, another pharaoh's assassination was terrifyingly real. Ancient court documents detail a treacherous plot deep within the royal harem, around 1155 BCE, where a secondary wife named Tia conspired to assassinate King Ramses III. For 3,000 years, historians debated if the coup succeeded because paranoid embalmers had wrapped the king's neck in unusually thick, impenetrable linen. In 2012, CT scans finally peered beneath those bandages and discovered a massive gash across his throat, deep enough to sever the trachea in a single devastating stroke. But it gets darker. Scans also revealed that one of his toes had been hacked off with a completely different, blunt weapon, proving he was ambushed by multiple attackers. Ramses III is now the oldest confirmed assassinated head of state in human history. Which brings us back to that 13mm arrowhead and the man known as Otzi the Iceman. For a decade after his discovery in 1991, he was written off as a tragic victim of exposure. Then came the 2001 scan, revealing the flint buried in his back, severing his subclavian artery. 3D reconstruction proved the shot came from behind and below, fired by a sniper roughly 30 meters away. Ötzi never saw it coming. But the DNA evidence turns a simple murder into a sprawling, ancient thriller. Blood from 4 different people was found on his dagger, his coat, and a single arrow in his quiver. A deep, partially healed gash on his right hand proved he had been in a brutal, close-quarters fight days before his death. Investigators now believe he survived a lethal brawl, only to be tracked through the mountains and executed in a calculated ambush.
It was an assassination carried out over multiple days, millennia before anyone thought to look closely enough to notice. But the case isn't closed. The one detail forensics cannot crack is who pulled the bowstring. Which of the 4 people whose blood stained his gear fired the fatal shot? 5,300 years later, the oldest solved murder in human history still has an empty suspect box. If you have a theory about who hunted the Iceman down, or which of these 10 ancient crime scenes shocked you the most, drop it in the comments below, because the next cold case we unearth might be even older and just as dangerous.